Hi everybody, welcome to my homestead and welcome to my channel. My name is Jared. If you haven't already, please make sure to subscribe. I found something so amazing, so interesting. It has to do with Jubilees and it has to do with Joseph Smith. I got this email from Amber Williams. And normally I would read the whole email, but it's a little bit too long for this video. I need to just hone in on this one thing. She included this quote from the josephsmithpapers.org website. This is from one of Joseph Smith's journals, and it's at the time of the dedication of the Kirtland Temple, and he talks about how that was going to be a day of Pentecost, but he also instituted or said that they were going to celebrate a year of Jubilee. And I have a spreadsheet for Jubilees. It's been a while since I've talked about it. Don't worry, we're going to review what a Jubilee is. But naturally, the question for me and for many of you is, would a Jubilee year have anything to do with the second coming? Is this something that we should look for either, in Judaism, in the Jews, and or should we look to the Book of Mormon because there's some hints in there about what year was a Jubilee year? What have we done in the church, including what I just found out from Joseph Smith? It turns out that not only did he declare a couple years Jubilee years, but it seems that he was about to institute the what's called the Shemitah cycle, or the Sabbatical years. In Judaism, they think of years as days. So like you have these cycles where you go through 7 years and it's like a week of years. So you have a Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. They don't call it these names, of course. But the Sabbath day of years is called the Shemitah, or we would call it a sabbatical year. And it's a special year. And so it turns out that there's these kind of, what are possibly Joseph Smith, and of course it would come from the Lord. It's not like it's Joseph Smith's idea, but I'm just calling them Joseph Smith Shemitah years or sabbatical years. And when you plot it on a timeline like this and look at where we're at right now, there's some really interesting things. So I'm going to save that for just a little later on. First, we need to do a little bit of review and homework. So thank you, Amber. I'll reply to your email after I do this video, but I can't cover the whole email. We're just going to focus on this Jubilee thing, and thank you for bringing this to my attention. Okay, so Jubilee, what is that? Go to the Old Testament, Leviticus 25, and let me just read a few of the key verses. And the Lord spake unto Moses in Mount Sinai, saying, Speak unto the children of Israel, and say unto them, When ye come into the land which I give you, then shall the land keep a Sabbath unto the Lord. Okay, the land shall keep a Sabbath. 6 years thou shalt sow thy field, and 6 years thou shalt prune thy vineyard, and gather in the fruit thereof. But in the 7th year, but in the 7th year shall be a Sabbath of rest unto the land, a Sabbath for the Lord. Thou shalt neither sow thy field nor prune thy vineyard. We're going to skip down. Thou shalt remember 7 Sabbaths of years unto thee, 7 times 7 years, and the space of the 7 Sabbaths of years shall be unto thee 49 years. Okay, so you go through these 7 weeks of years, so 49 years. Then shalt thou cause the trumpet of the Jubilee to sound on the 10th day of the 7th month, which is the Day of Atonement, or Yom Kippur. And it says right here, In the Day of Atonement shall ye make the trumpet sound throughout all your land. And ye shall hallow the 50th year. So this is the Jubilee year right here. Ye shall hallow the 50th year, and proclaim liberty throughout all the land unto all the inhabitants thereof. It shall be a Jubilee unto you. And ye shall return every man unto his possession, and ye shall return every man unto his family. A Jubilee shall that 50th year be unto you. Ye shall not sow, neither reap. And then it goes on. I'm not going to actually read this whole thing, but so you can read more about it here. What's interesting is you'll notice this part. Then shalt thou cause the trumpet of the Jubilee to sound. We're going to read some more stuff, but it makes me think of Doctrine and Covenants 29, verse 26, where it says, But behold, verily I say unto you, before the earth shall pass away, Michael, or Adam, my archangel, shall sound his trump, and then shall all the dead awake, for their grave shall be opened, and they shall come forth, yea, even all. So the general resurrection, or the first resurrection, which I believe is what's being talked about here, it starts with a trump, right? And it's at the second coming. When Christ comes, that's when those who are alive are quickened and caught up, and those that are dead are resurrected and also caught up. But Adam, or Michael, at the sound of his trump. And it actually ties in to the idea of Jubilee. Now we're going to go to the Institute Student Manual, and then just hang on, because we're going to be looking at what the Jews have been doing. We're going to look at Joseph Smith and what I found out that he did during his lifetime. We're going to look at an official Jubilee that the church actually did in 1880, like in a very real way, an actual Jubilee. And another couple just like interesting things. Okay, so Institute Student Manual for the Old Testament, the Sabbatical, and Jubilee Year. Many today look upon the law of Moses as primitive, lesser law designed for a spiritually illiterate and immature people. This chapter illustrates the commitment of faith and trust in God that was required for one who truly followed the law. The Israelite was told that once in every 7 years, he was to trust wholly in God rather than in the fruits of his own labor for sustenance. Yeah, could you do that? Could you be told, yeah, you're a farmer, for that every 7 years, you're not going to farm. Just trust me. I think I know some people that might have some problems with that, maybe even myself. It might be a little bit difficult. The land, too, was to have its Sabbath rest, and no plowing, sowing, reaping, or harvesting was to take place. Further, once each 50 years, the land would have a double rest. So the one rest would be during the Sabbatical year, or the Shemitah, and then the Jubilee comes right after that seventh Shemitah. Right? So you have the 7 weeks. Each week has a Sabbath. The Sabbath is the Shemitah. It's a year of rest. And then after the 49th, or the 49th year, the 7th Shemitah, the very next year is the 50th year, and that's the Jubilee. And so it's a double rest. The 7th sabbatical year, the 49th year, was to be followed by a Jubilee year. God had delivered Israel from the bondage of Egypt, forgiven their numerous debts to him, and given them an inheritance in the land of promise. To demonstrate their love of God and fellow men, Israel was to follow that example during the Jubilee year. Slaves or servants were to be freed, the land returned to its original owner, and debts forgiven. You know, this sounds a lot like, I think, it sounds kind of like the final judgment, but it also sounds like the second coming, because the righteous are going to inherit the earth. There's places that are off limits right now. Whether it's because you have like military installations, for example, there's not going to be any military during the millennium, so that land will be freed up. But you also have nations. The whole world is very divided. There's places that you couldn't really expect to go buy a house. Things are going to change in a very radical way during the millennium. Everyone's going to have somewhere that they can go, and there's probably going to be more options. But we're also going to be freed from the sin that has existed for these 6,000 years. And then for those that have died, they're going to inherit their bodies again. They've had to give up their bodies. They go to the spirit world. They were righteous, but they go to the spirit world. But after so much time, now it's time to be resurrected, and you re-inherit your now perfected body. So this really could be a very second coming thing. It talks about it down here. It talks about the general resurrection and how that plays in. So I'm not gonna read the rest of this. I can already feel this is gonna go pretty long. So you get the idea. Okay, so let's just start. This might look kind of confusing, and believe me, it was confusing to put together, but I finally have a pretty good handle on it. We're going to go from left to right. You'll notice in row 1, I have these different titles of these columns. The first one is Destruction of First Temple. So what we're going to read comes from Chabad.org, which is a Jewish website. And it's really good for those that are trying to learn Judaism. It's geared towards those that are Jewish that have stepped away from the religion to help them, live their religion. So this article is by Baruch S. Davidson. He's a rabbi. When is the next Jubilee year? We're going to go to my spreadsheet because I copied this down. And for some reason, Chabad.org, you can't do highlights on it. So we're going to go to my spreadsheet because here I have my highlights. And I don't want to read this whole thing. So according to Rabbi Baruch S. Davidson, the Jubilee is only observed when all 12 tribes of the Jewish nation are living in Israel. And to summarize, it's basically because a lot of this has to do with land and who owns land. And so if there's no one in the land to own the land, then what's the point of the Jubilee? That's like kind of a big part of it. Later, he talks about the last time that a Jubilee, according to Judaism, was observed. And says right here, thus, let me read this. However, according to the first opinion mentioned above, with the exile of the northern kingdom, the required condition for the Jubilee to be sanctified was lost. Thus, the last time there was a biblical requirement to observe the Jubilee was about 150 years before the destruction of the first temple. So that was in 586 BC. So 150 years before that was 736 BC. Later he says, as mentioned above, though, today the Jubilee year is neither designated nor observed. Well, that depends on, I guess that depends on your rabbi, because I'm going to show you there are some Jews that have decided to start counting the Jubilee year again. That's a somewhat recent development. We'll look at that in just a second. So, but going with what he said, here's 736 BC. And then I have all the Jubilee years that would have continued after that had it continued to be observed. So the next one would have been 686 BC, which is 50 years later. And then you just keep going 50 years, 50 years, 50 years. Okay. So fast forward to today. If that had continued, and it hasn't, but if it had, then roughly, and I say roughly because sometimes it's hard to pinpoint the exact dates with certain things, but it seems that 2015, give or take a year, would have been the Jubilee. And so the next one would be in 2065. Okay, so that's interesting to note. But, we just recently would have had that not too long ago, about 9 years ago. But what about the Jews that I was just talking about that have decided to restart the Jubilee cycle? Well, it's happened. We're going to Israel 365 News. This is an article by Adam Eliyahu Berkowitz. Sanhedrin revives 2,000-year-old blessing for counting of Jubilee year. Now, let me just say, I don't know that all Jews worldwide would view this as valid, because I've noticed that you have groups like the Temple Institute or this Sanhedrin, which there's no centralized authority in Judaism, like worldwide. In Israel, you do have like a chief rabbi, but, I think there's like a chief rabbi, like a Sephardic chief rabbi, and I don't know if there's one for the Ashkenazi Jews, but anyway, there's not really a central authority, but these guys decided to put together a Sanhedrin, which is kind of like a legal body, almost like a parliament or Congress, but like in Jewish law. And it says, unbeknownst to all but a few witnesses, as Rosh Hashanah ended 11 months ago, the nascent Sanhedrin concluded months of deliberation by ruling that certain conditions had been met requiring the nation of Israel to begin counting the Jubilee cycle. Rabbi Avraham Dov Ben Shor recited the blessing, and the 49-year cycle began again. When Rosh Hashanah, the Jewish New Year, ends next Tuesday evening, it'll be time for Jews to count the second year of the Jubilee cycle. This article is from September 27th, 2016. Fast forward. This one is from just a couple months ago, October 23rd, 2024. Sanhedrin counts the Jubilee cycle in Jerusalem. And here they are. You have people there from the Temple Institute and the Sanhedrin. When Rosh Hashanah ended, it was time for Jews to count the 10th year of the Jubilee cycle. This year is the 10th year of the first Jubilee, which is 1 week in 3 years for the first sabbatical in the first Jubilee. So let's visualize what that means. In column E, I've shown what they're doing. So in green, that's a year when the sabbatical year or the Shemitah began. And it's on Rosh Hashanah. That's the Jewish New Year. And it's typically in September. Sometimes it's in October. So that's when the year starts. So you had the Shemitah year that started in 2014, and then it ended in September or October of 2015. And so right after that, they started counting the Jubilee year. Okay, so Shemitah, and then the next year, Jubilee, not Jubilee year, but the first of, the 50 years. So they started counting. So one right here in column D, 1, 2, 3, all the way to 2064, if they keep this up and if the second coming hasn't happened by then, which I'm sure it will, by the way, but I can't guarantee that. If it continues like it is, then the Jubilee would be in 2064. Okay? So, and it's interesting because you'll notice with the destruction of the first temple, we were talking about 2015 AD probably being the year that the Jubilee would have been in, the most recent one. And that lines up pretty good with what they're doing because they started the count of the Jubilee year, the first year of the 50, in 2015. So, it must go together. They must have planned it that way. I haven't dug that deep into it, but that's probably why. So, okay, so there's that. And then if you're curious, we just had a Shemitah year from September of 2021 until September or October of 2022. The next one is going to start in 2028. So in case that's interesting to you, you may already know, you may have already figured it out, but in case you didn't, that might be something to look at. And the reason why is because it seems like the Lord still does things on these special times on the Hebrew calendar. So just as an example, Elijah came to the Kirtland Temple, him and Christ and Moses and Elias, they came to the Kirtland Temple on Bikurim, or first fruits. Okay, or which also in that year coincided with Easter. They're not always on the same day. Like the Hebrew calendar, first fruits and Easter, they're not always on the same day each year. So in that year it was, and that's when they came. Joseph Smith received the gold plates on the Feast of Trumpets, otherwise known as Rosh Hashanah, which was very fitting because it's the Feast of Trumpets. There's the warning call, blowing the shofar. It's meant to call you to remembrance and repentance and preparation for the next 10 days, which lead up to the Day of Atonement, the Day of Awe. Or those are the days of awe, and then the Day of Atonement is Yom Kippur. Okay, so it's like the Book of Mormon, which was translated from the gold plates. It's the warning call to the world, right? So these things seem to still matter, at least to some degree, even now in this last dispensation. So that's why we may want to keep an eye on this, especially with what I'm about to show you with Joseph Smith's Shemitahs or sabbatical years. Okay, so let's move on from the Jews and let's talk about the Book of Mormon. Okay, so let me see. Right here. Okay, you have this article in the Ensign. This is from the February 1988 Ensign, New Developments in Book of Mormon Research. And there's a part here by Gordon C. Thomason. And this is him right here. He's a scholar. Professor Emeritus of Anthropology and History, has taught at Marlborough College, the City University of New York, the School of International Training, Broome Community College, and Cuttington University College, Liberia. So, and there's more. So that's who we're listening to right here. There are more than 30 occasions when the Book of Mormon makes it clear to those who know something about Israelite religion that its peoples, excluding the Jaredites who came earlier, knew and practiced the religion of the Mosaic Law, including all the festivals, feasts, and holy days based upon the Exodus. At the end of this paragraph, and in parentheses, he says, Alma, chapter 30, verse 3, this appears, incidentally, to be a Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, and Jubilee Year text. So let's go to that. And I'm not sure exactly how he came to this conclusion. You guys, when I was making this video, I thought it was going to be like quick. I was like, oh yeah, this is going to be a great video. It won't take too long. No, it took forever. It took forever. And so I wasn't able, this is going to be something I'm probably going to revisit in the future. So maybe in the surrounding chapters, that's what led him to that conclusion. But Alma chapter 30, verse 2, it talks about after the days of fasting and mourning and prayer. So maybe he's taking that to mean the 10 days of awe, Rosh Hashanah to Yom Kippur. And then verse 3 is the one that he referenced. Yea, and the people did observe the commandments of the Lord, and they were strict in observing the ordinances of God according to the law of Moses, for they were taught to keep the law of Moses until it should be fulfilled. So I don't know. I'll go with his expertise. So let's just say that that's the case. Let's say that Alma chapter 30, there was a Jubilee year that was taking place. And in the Book of Mormon, in the chapter heading, it always has this approximation of dates. So in this case, sometime between 76 to 74 BC. So I put that on the spreadsheet. And it's really interesting. I just went with 74, or what was it again? Sorry. Yeah, 76 to 74. So I went with 74 BC. I think I did more on this on the last video because I have King Benjamin up here. I'm going to have to revisit this again. But whatever the case, 74 BC, you do every 50 years. And if you if that's the correct chronology, okay, if they actually have it correct, like say that the Jews over here, they don't, say that the Book of Mormon has the correct dates and say that it is 74 BC, well, that would mean that the next Jubilee, if you fast forward to our time, would be sometime around 2027, give or take a year. And keep in mind, the Salt Lake Temple is going to be rededicated in 2026. The last that we heard, it's going to be toward the end of 2026. I think that's what President Nelson said in this last General Conference. So, no, that's kind of interesting. Okay, so Book of Mormon. So you have the destruction of the first temple. You have those years, and then you have what the Jews are currently doing. At least a group of them in Jerusalem or in Israel this is what they're doing. Then we have the Book of Mormon. Okay. Now let's get into Joseph Smith and Joseph Smith's Jubilees and Shemitah cycles or sabbatical years. All right. So we're on josephsmithpapers.org. And this is from a journal of Joseph Smith's journal, 1835 to 1836. So this was the Kirtland period. And I'm going to read from the historical What is this again? This is the source note. I'm just going to read a few things from here. On March 30th, 1836, Joseph Smith announced the celebration of a Jubilee for the church. Later on, for those officers who remained, the Jubilee and Passover were a week. So not a year. A Jubilee is a year. So I'm not exactly sure what was going on here, but for those officers who remained, the Jubilee and the Passover were a week of visiting, feasting, prophesying, and pronouncing blessings on one another. And then down here, the Jubilee ended on the 6th of April, so Christ's birthday, the 6th of April, 1836, the first day of the church's 7th year. So that's interesting, right? Because we've been talking about 7 years. 7 years is a key characteristic of the Jubilees because you have 7 sets of them for a total of 49 years. So the church's, this is the first day of the church's 7th year. So there's some oddities here because it doesn't exactly line up with how they did it in the Old Testament or how Jews do it today, which is fine because this is the restoration and not everything is exactly the same as the Old Testament. Christ came, he fulfilled the law. There's things that we still do, obviously, but it's not exactly the same. So in this case, he declared a Jubilee. It was not like a year. It was just like a week, a week or less. But it coincided with the dedication of the Kirtland Temple. Okay. Now let's go into the actual journal. Let me just read what it says here. Savior made his appearance to some, while angels ministered unto others. And it was a Pentecost and endowment indeed, long to be remembered, for the sound shall go forth from this place. So there's like that trumpet imagery. Remember the sounding the trump in the Jubilee. Remembered, for the sound shall go forth from this place into all the world, and the occurrences of this day shall be handed down upon the pages of sacred history to all generations as the day of Pentecost. So shall this day be numbered. Look at this. Numbered. I should have highlighted that. Numbered and celebrated as a year of Jubilee. Oh, okay. I guess I missed that. He did call it a year. I'm not sure. So I don't know. I don't know. The source note said that the Jubilee was just from this time to this time, but maybe it was the whole year. I'm still a little bit confused about some of this, so just forgive me. Maybe if you understand better, let me know in the comments. Okay, this day shall be numbered, excuse me, and celebrated as a year of Jubilee and time of rejoicing to saints of the Most High God. All right. Now, so that was, okay, so that's the Kirtland Temple. Okay, so, okay, it's a Jubilee. Well, it turns out that he did this again before he died. This is a year before he died. So this is the 6th of April. So that seems to, like, nowadays, that seems to be strongly associated with the Jubilee, as you're about to see. So Thursday, April 6th, 1843, the first day of the Jubilee of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, a special conference assembled on the platform of the temple on rough floor of the basement at 10 o'clock a.m. Okay, so you might be confused because this isn't 50 years later, and a Jubilee is characterized by being 50 years after the last one. So what's that about? Well, thankfully, joesmithpapers.org has this footnote 119, and it tells you to go look at what Wilford Woodruff said about this. So we'll do that. Let's go over to the Wilford Woodruff Papers project. And on that same day, so this is his journal. You can see the actual journal over here to the left, and then the transcription over here to the right. And I'm trying to refresh this because I had highlights, but I guess I didn't save it. So, okay. So before we read the transcript, if you've been watching my channel for a while, or if you're familiar with Wilford Woodruff's journals and writings, he liked to draw a lot. He had like these little symbols to help him remember the significance of that day, or to help him kind of like visually, quickly be able to like see, oh yeah, I remember this one. He had like codes. And so he drew this symbol, and the website, let me just show you, when you click on this, it'll like give you a reference for what a lot of them mean. There were ones that he used over and over again, but this one he did not. Excuse me. This one is a unique one. And you can see, you can kind of make out, it says Jubilee right there. Jubilee, Jubilee right here. And it has April 6th, 1843. Okay. So this must have stood out to him. Let's read what he said. April 6th, Jubilee, 1843. The Conference of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints met at the Temple of the Lord at Nauvoo at 10 o'clock a.m. It held Thursday, Friday, and Saturday, 3 days. It is the commencement of the 14th year. Okay, so the 14th year. So in other words, the second like sabbatical year. So it seems like Joseph Smith he's calling it a Jubilee, but this is the Shemitah, or the sabbatical year. So it is the commencement of the 14th year of the church, which makes it the commencement of the Jubilee. We had an interesting time through the conference. And then that's it. He doesn't write anything else. I should point out, let me just read what the Joseph Smith Papers Project said. So, the anniversary of the organization of the church on April 6, 1830, Wilford Woodruff noted that the term Jubilee was used because this anniversary marked the commencement of the 14th year of the church, an apparent reference to an adaptation of the 7-year sabbatical cycle outlined in the Old Testament. So, as far as I know, beyond what we know is said is in the Old Testament, I don't have anything that I can really refer to for this last dispensation about this new type of sabbatical year or Jubilee. It's not even clear if it's really an official thing or if it was just these 2 times. Now, remember, Joseph Smith died the next year. He was murdered the next year. So I don't know if this would have continued. I don't know if the Lord has instructed the prophets to just kind of privately still keep these 7-year sabbatical years or Jubilees, as maybe they're now called. I don't know. But I wouldn't be surprised, because look at this. Let's go back to my spreadsheet. So I put it all here. So you have column L to show you, like, here's the first week or the first set of 7 days. Okay. If the Lord's intention was to have Joseph Smith observe in some way Shemitah years. So this would be the first one. So 1830 to 1836. Okay. That's the first Jubilee or Shemitah. Okay. Based on Wilford Woodruff's definition, or the way that he seemed to talk about it. And then you go to 1843, and that was the second one. That's what we just read from Wilford Woodruff and from Joseph Smith, that on April 6th, that was the commencement of that year being a Jubilee. Okay. And so you go on down the line, I was like, well, what if it had continued, or maybe it is continuing and we just don't know. But if it continued, there's a few interesting things that come up. So let's pretend that after 7 of those, you get to the year 1878. And so what's not clear is if there would have been like a traditional Jubilee after that 49th year, You see how this is the 49th year and it completes the 7 sets. It's not clear if the year after that was intended to be a Jubilee like in the Old Testament. But let me show you something. So let's just pretend that that was the case. And maybe that is the case. So I did this dark color red for a hypothetical Joseph Smith Jubilee is what I'm calling it. Okay. Well, it turns out that the year after that, what would have been, the Joseph Smith Jubilee in 1880, the church actually did have an actual Jubilee. So let's take a look at that really quick. Okay, so this is in a church manual called Our Heritage. This is chapter 8. And this section is called the Jubilee Conference. On April 6th, there it is again, 1880, church members celebrated the 50th anniversary of the organization of the church. So, in this case, they were more focused on 50 years after 1830. Okay? So, but here, it's not like with this cycle right here, it's not like that. So, the first year, the first count, of the 50 Jubilee years or the 50-year cycle, the first count would be 1830. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And that's the year that the current temple was dedicated. And Joseph Smith proclaimed it a Jubilee, which presumably meant like a sabbatical year, right? And then you do the next 7, and you go down and you get to the 7th. And it would, the last, like I said, the last Shemitah year would have been 1878, and the Jubilee would have been 1879 if you're doing it that way. But the church is just like clicking it to this nice round number of 1880. You just take 1830 plus 50 days. So it's not like it doesn't match up perfectly. You get what I'm saying? And I don't know that it really matters because they did it. Obviously, it was meant to be done. So on April 6th, 1880, church members celebrated the 50th anniversary of the organization of the church. They called it a Jubilee Year, uppercase. As the ancient Israelites had named every 50th year. President Taylor forgave many of the debts owed to the church by its needy members. The church also contributed 300 cows and 2,000 sheep to be distributed among its quote-unquote deserving poor. The church's Relief Society sisters donated almost 35,000 bushels of wheat to those in need. President Taylor also urged church members to forgive individual debt, especially among the distressed. Quote, "It is the time of Jubilee," he declared. A spirit of forgiveness and joy was strongly felt among the Latter-day Saints. And it talks a little bit more, but nothing too applicable to what we're talking about. So 50 years later, they had an actual Jubilee. So this is why we should maybe pay attention to this, because the church has taken action on this idea in the past, and it hasn't been too obvious recently, but it may suddenly become really important. What if like President Nelson, or after him, if it's President Oaks or whoever, what if we have a Jubilee in our future? What if the Jubilee is going to be the second coming? So you see what I mean? So let's go over here. Now, what happens after this? This is what would happen. So the Jewish method, in the way that's described in the Old Testament, is you count to 50, and then the next year after 50, you just start over. So 1, 2, 3, and you go like that. But if you continue with the Joseph Smith Shemitahs, if it just continues every 7 years, because again, it's not clear if there was meant to be a Jubilee, if that Jubilee would have followed this pattern. So you get to 50 and then you count 1. So hopefully this is a part where you might get a little bit mixed up. Just rewind it if you need to, or just look at the chart. So what I did in the absence of any other information is I just assumed, well, what if the Joseph Smith Shemitah years just continue every 7 years? They just continue every 7 years. What would that look like? Well, if you do that, and there's reason to believe that maybe that's how it's supposed to be, when you fast forward, let's see, where's my first one? You would have had a Joseph Smith Shemitah in 1976. It was the bicentennial of the United States. So that's kind of interesting. And if you would have kept doing the Joseph Smith Jubilee, where the next year would have been a Jubilee, then that would have been in 1977, and you got those 2 sevens. And believe me, the number 7 shows up so often. I always think of like the St. George, Utah temple. It's the longest operating temple in the church, like continually operating temple. It was dedicated in 1877, and I don't think that's a mistake. Joseph Smith, he was 14 when he had the first vision. That's 2 sevens. So it's a thing. It's a thing. So it's interesting that it played out this way. The Joseph Smith Shemitah on the bicentennial of the United States, and the next year, which presumably may have been a Joseph Smith Jubilee, 1977. But that's not all. Continuing, keep going. Okay, now you get up to 2018. And we talk about this year all the time because that's when things really, really started happening in President Nelson's presidency. That's when he became president of the church. And it just so happens that it would have been the Joseph Smith 27th sabbatical year, or Shemitah. Like it's enough for me that it happened in a sabbatical year. This like hypothetical, I don't know if it's a real thing, but Joseph Smith Shemitah. But it also has a 7 in it, the 27th. So, okay. And then you go down a little bit more, and next year is 2025, and it's going to be President Nelson's 7-year anniversary. So of course it's going to be another Joseph Smith Shemitah. And what's interesting is when you look at it like this, now maybe it's making a little bit more sense. These total solar eclipses, these great American solar eclipses. The one in 2017 came the year before this Shemitah. This is the one that the path of totality went over Jackson County and Far West and Adirondack. I know there's all the other things that the other Christians focus on. I'm more concerned with what would actually be specific to our church. This is the site of the New Jerusalem, which President Nelson has just talked about in his most recent General Conference talk. But then 7 years later, in 2024, and before this next Shemitah year, you had the 2024 eclipse. And what's interesting is that the path of totality went over the Kirtland Temple, where we had the first Jubilee, however you define that right now in this dispensation. It's where we had the first one. And the church had just purchased the Kirtland Temple the month before that. And then this next year is going to be the 28th sabbatical year of Joseph Smith's, 7-year cycle. And then after that, if I'm right at all about this like Jubilee thing, like 50 after 7 Joseph Smith cycles on the 50th year, it's a Jubilee, kind of like the Old Testament. Well, that year would just happen to be the year that the Salt Lake Temple is going to be rededicated. So this is mind-blowing to me. It may not be to you, and that's fine. Just be kind in the comments. I would ask you to be kind. But I don't know. There you have it. So, and you can take it further. The next Joseph Smith Jubilee after that would be 2075. I'm definitely not looking that far out. So you can take some time and look at this yourself if you'd like. The link is in the description box below. And I'm probably going to rename this, but I currently have it named Judaism Jubilees at the bottom here, this tab right here. So, okay. So there's a few more things I want to show you, and then we'll wrap up. Let's see. Yeah, I'm adding some entries on my quotes A through Z spreadsheet for Jubilee and sabbatical years or Shemitahs. I'm going to add more quotes, the ones that we've read in this video. We read that. Okay. In the October 1999 General Conference, so this was the final General Conference of that millennium, Elder L. Tom Perry of the Quorum of the 12 Apostles gave a talk called A Year of Jubilee. And he was referring to the year 2000. So if we go back to my spreadsheet and you go further to the right, you'll notice column Q, where the church, I mean, this wouldn't fit into column Q, but we've talked about how they've kind of clicked these years to these nice round numbers. So 1830 all the way until, then you had the 1880 Jubilee. And then I'm not aware of like any special thing happening in those other years afterwards, but we'll see what happens in the year 2030 if the second coming hasn't already happened yet. But let's see. Sorry, I'm telling you. Okay, another thing to keep in mind, there may be something to the Jubilee years of the first vision. I mean, in 2020, the April 2020 General Conference was a very special conference. And in a sense, it was a Jubilee year. Just when you're thinking in 50s, in groups of 50 years, it was 200 years after the first vision. Well, now we have Elder L. Tom Perry, who's talking about the year 2000, which isn't part of either of these, but it is a nice round number. Let's just read somewhat what he said. I am sure I will always remember being the first speaker in the last session of this historic General Conference. It not only is the last session of this conference, it is the last session of this decade. It is the last session which will bear the date of the 1900s. This session ought to be worthy of a special journal entry. Kind of like Wilford Woodruff. The Lord, through all periods of time, has reminded his children of their duty to him. I've always been interested in the way the Lord instructed and tended Israel during the 40 years they wandered in the wilderness. In the book of Leviticus, so named because it relates to the duties and teachings of the Levites, instructions are given for the year of Jubilee and its observance. I believe there's a message for us in how Israel celebrated that special year. And then he reads some of the scriptures that we already read and says, the law connected with the Jubilee year embraced 3 points. First, the people were to rest the land so it could be rejuvenated and more productive in future years. And it's interesting because in the millennium, the land is going to rest in a sense. It's going to be a paradisiacal earth. We know that from the book of Moses that the earth seems to be a sentient being of some kind, and it mourns the wickedness that's on the face of the earth. And, mankind is doing all sorts of stuff that's probably not good. It's going to be a peaceful time, both for mankind and for animals and for the earth. So, okay. The second law connected with the Jubilee year was the reversion of property to its original owners or his heirs. If we had this practice today, on January 1st, I could go north to Perry, Utah, and ask of the occupants of the land that my great-grandfather owned to leave so my family could again take possession. What an interesting arrangement, designed to preserve land for each succeeding generation to enjoy as their inheritance. Of course, such practices of land ownership do not exist today, so the people of Perry, Utah need not worry, but the practice of preserving other forms of inheritance like our heritage should be encouraged. So again, you guys, there's going to be a lot of changes that come with the second coming in the millennium. The righteous, they're going to inherit the earth. The pure in heart, they're going to inherit the earth. We're going to go through this. The wicked are going to be destroyed. There's going to be a depopulation event. The government is going to be restructured. Ownership of land is going to be different because at some point, I'm sure the full law of consecration, including and up to and maybe beyond the United Order, is going to be implemented. It's going to be different. So there's not going to be all these places that are off limits to you because some organization owns it. Well, there's still going to be organizations, but you know what I mean? Like there's people aren't going to be as greedy when it comes to land ownership in the millennium. Okay, continuing. Finally, during the year of Jubilee, all the Israelites who were in bondage for some reason were granted their freedom. Of course, the practice of slavery has long since been abolished in almost all parts of the world. Nevertheless, if we are not watchful, any one of us can become ensnared, then enslaved by the evil one. And that's another thing, is that Satan is going to be bound during the millennium. In fact, it's interesting because when you go to, this is the Bible dictionary for Jubilee, and it says it in the scriptures, but it's just easier to read it here. It says, all bondmen of Israelite birth were set free. And I think that the lesson in that, or the symbolism, is that if you're living righteously, if you're worthy of inheriting the millennium, if you're a good, upright person, then you will possess the land, but the wicked will not. All right, later on, that actually might be it. Oh, at the end, he says, may God bless us that we may look forward to a new century with faith, testimony, confidence, and determination to better prepare ourselves for the eternal life we are all seeking. May the new year begin with the sound of trumpets and joyful shouts as we make the most of this coming year of Jubilee, is my humble prayer in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen. So I don't think he was like necessarily calling it like an official year of Jubilee, but maybe in some way it was. I don't know. I don't have the answers, but I'm going to take note. I'm just going to take note and put together a crazy spreadsheet like this. Okay. And then just two more things that are really quick. I do want to point out that the BYU Jerusalem Center is on a 49-year lease. Now, that's not like a special, my understanding is that it's not like the church is like, 49 years will be just fine. My understanding is that that's like a typical like lease term for that type of building, and it can be renewed. And for all I know, I haven't looked into it. They may have 49 years. It may, be a nod to the Old Testament, or maybe there is some religious thing to it, with the Jews in Israel. Maybe they wanted to kind of base it on the Old Testament or something, but I don't know for sure. But this article is from May 21st, 1988. So that's when the lease was signed. And so I decided to put that on here. And I am of the opinion that the BYU Jerusalem Center can be converted into a temple. And I'll just put out the disclaimers. Nobody knows what the Lord's plans are for that building. Okay. We know that the New Jerusalem is a city that has multiple temples. It has a 24 temple complex. There could be multiple temples in Jerusalem. This one may be one of them. It doesn't matter if it wasn't made to be a temple, because neither was the Provo City Center temple, or the Manhattan, New York temple, or the Copenhagen, New York, oh my gosh, it's late and it took a long time to prepare this video. And also the Copenhagen, Denmark temple, they were not built to be temples, but yet they are. The buildings can be repurposed. I feel like this is a way that the prophecy of a temple in Jerusalem can be fulfilled in a natural way, and also in a way where it's not obvious, so that you're just ready at all times. You're not like, oh, now we have the temple, now I better really shape up. It's like, no, I'll give you some room to doubt and think that you still have time, but you should be at all times preparing yourself for the second coming. Anyway, I think that it could be. President Jeffrey R. Holland has said some really interesting things about the BYU Jerusalem Center, which he was instrumental in making it happen. But anyway, the lease is up, or it's like up for a renewal in 2038. Okay, 2038. And that's the last thing that I have on my spreadsheet. There is one other thing that just happened to come up as I was preparing for this video. This is from Newsroom on the church website, and it was talking about the Philippines. And in this case, I don't think it was talking about Jubilee in the sense of like a as having like religious significance per se, although I don't know. It says, for the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, 2011 was a Jubilee year in the Philippines, as the country commemorates the 50th year since the commencement of missionary work in the land. So that's all that I have. It's interesting stuff. I think that we should just watch it, be aware of it. Things, they seem to be happening right now, but I'm especially interested in these, what I call, for lack of a better term, Joseph Smith sabbatical years, just because they line up perfectly with President Nelson's presidency. I'm impressed with the eclipses and when they happened. We've always known, you and I, even before I started this channel, we've always known that they were about 7 years apart. But now putting it on here like this, maybe this is the reason why. Maybe this is the reason why. And then the Salt Lake Temple in 2026. Very interesting. So 2025, it's about to be New Year's. So 2025, according to this cycle, if it even is a thing, is going to be the Sabbath of years. I have Sunday, like for the Jews, they would have, Saturday, but since it's our church, I'm just going to put Sunday. So, exciting times. Okay, that's going to be it for this one. If you haven't already, please make sure to subscribe. Like this video if you liked it. Leave your thoughts and opinions down in the comments below. Also, make sure to share it, and I'll talk to you guys later.